Hey, what's up, beautiful souls? Today, I want to dive into something that's been sitting heavy on my chest ever since I watched this podcast episode, which featured Aubrey Marcus, his wife, Vylana, their new partner, Alana, and spiritual philosopher, Dr. Mark Gafni. Now, look, I'm not here to criticize anyone. I'm not here to gossip. I'm just here to have an honest conversation about truth, power, love, and the way spirituality can sometimes be used to justify dynamics that feel more performative than more present, all right? This episode isn't about polyamory versus monogamy. It's not about whether spiritual relationships are better or worse. It's just about asking, what really happens when influence, ego, and sacred language mix in a way that feels a little bit off, all right? Who really benefits, who bends, and who loses their voice in the name of growth? And today, we'll be talking about Aubrey's charisma and whether it's guiding or blinding, Vylana's subtle energetic shift from a vibrant force to maybe more soft agreement, Alana's initiation into this dynamic that feels more spiritualized than sovereign, at least to me, and what Dr. Gafni's role is. Is he offering wisdom or just dressing up the decisions of a friend with spiritual authority? So if you've ever questioned the power dynamics behind someone else's version of conscious love, if you've ever felt like your own intuition was getting overwhelmed by the pressure to be evolved, if you want real talk about what it means to be in the right, healthy relationship with others and with yourself, then this episode is definitely for you. So let's start off by talking about Aubrey Marcus, the man, the mystic, the messenger. He's got his magnetic presence. When he speaks, it's smooth, it's passionate, it's intentional. He has that rare ability to blend spirituality with actual performance in the real world. And he's weaving ancient wisdom with modern podcast delivery. So I'm not here to demonize the guy. In fact, I used to listen to him quite a bit. He was the one that really opened me up to different plant medicines. I really love the way that he thought. And let's start off by what he does well, okay? So Aubrey, he's very charismatic. He has a great vocabulary. He has a lot of influence, and Aubrey has mastered the art of emotional resonance. He doesn't just speak to you, he speaks through you. So whether he's talking about plant medicines, vulnerability, death, or love, it feels like he's walked through the fire and wants you to walk with him. And that is really powerful. And he's also really committed to self-work. He's not just laying on his laurels of all the things that he's done. You know, I've seen this man do ayahuasca, dieta, shadow work, sweat lodges, you name it, he's done it all. And he's devoted himself to transformation. You could feel it in the way that he talks about death, love, purpose, and he's in the arena, and that deserves respect, all right? He's doing the work. He's also had a crazy amount of cultural impact. He's helped normalize psychedelic therapy, being masculine and also being vulnerable, and honesty in relationships. And these are really big contributions. He's encouraging men to feel, to break, to open, and in a society where we've been trained to armor up, that's no small thing. But, and here's where it gets real, that same charisma can become a veil, and that same self-work can become a brand, and that same devotion to Eros can become a hall pass for the ego. So let's talk about Eros, and I'm not an expert in Eros. I did some research, but Aubrey invokes it like a sacred fire, a divine current, and yes, Eros is the life force, the wild, the ecstatic, the infinite. Yes, I agree with that. But in this podcast, he bends that concept like molten steel just to justify his actions. This is my opinion, okay? So instead of Eros being a universal force of creation, it starts sounding like an inner compass that excuses desire, like I was just following the pulse of life. The universe gave me this message. This is our highest expression. And all of this sounds poetic, right? But when your feeling becomes the ultimate authority, who is holding you accountable? Eros without boundaries becomes indulgence, and spirituality without friction becomes delusional fantasy, all right? He elevates the relationship dynamic into mythos. He calls it sacred, revolutionary, cosmic, but where's the humility in all this messiness? He's smiling, he's just, I don't know, almost borderline arrogant on this podcast to me, and so where's the accountability for the pain that others may be feeling? When language elevates the self above the consequences, that is spiritual bypassing. And I saw a lot of that, especially when Dr. Gafni echoed the same sentiment to add scholarly weight to Aubrey's decisions. Okay? Aubrey is a brilliant orator. He weaves tantra, mythology, psychology, and quantum spirituality all in one breath. But sometimes he talks around his shadows instead of through them. So, for example, the pain of betrayal is reframed as medicine. The desire for another woman becomes soul-aligned expansion. And conflict is seen as initiatory fire instead of emotional damage. Now, don't get me wrong, spirituality can totally reframe pain, but when you skip over personal accountability and use divine language to justify them, it stops being healing and, in my opinion, becomes manipulation. All right? So the question is Aubrey searching for truth, or is he just building another stage? So to me, this is the core question. Is Aubrey truly surrendering to truth, or is he scripting a version of truth that fits his desires, wrapped in spiritual gold leaves? All right. So I personally don't think he's malicious. I think he believes in what he's doing, but intention isn't everything. All right. Impact matters. And when you have a massive audience, a beautiful wife, a new lover, a spiritual guide backing your every move, it's easy to confuse feedback loops for divine alignment. It's not easy to see when your shadow is being spiritualized and no longer questioned. All right, so if Aubrey really wants to lead a new paradigm, here's what I think would make it actually sacred. Number one, name the ego. Be explicit about how hard it is to resist the pull of identity, admiration, and control, especially as a male leader in this space. That honesty would help a lot of men who are listening to him. Number two is drop the mythos sometimes, okay? Not everything needs to be cosmic. Sometimes it's just hard. Sometimes it hurts. That's where real trust is built, with his audience and with his partners. All right. Number three is open the floor. Instead of speaking for Vylana or Alana or the relationship, give them more space to speak, to disagree, and to interrupt. That would signal that this is truly a shared leadership, not a narrative management. And number four is have a mirror. Invite public dialogue with those who lovingly challenge him, not just those who support him. That's where the deeper growth happens. And they happened to turn off all the comments on the podcast, and that really disappointed me. That showed me that he was not interested in having people mirror back to them what they felt about this podcast, okay? So to me, here's the real danger. Aubrey Marcus isn't just a man in a relationship. He's a model. He's an influencer. He's a myth maker. And when someone like that bypasses complexity, their impact begins to spread. Other men may mimic his spiritualized polyamory without emotional maturity to hold it. Women may override their intuition, believing they're not evolved enough if they struggle with jealousy or confusion. And seekers may mistake his charisma for consciousness, and to me, that's dangerous. And not because he's trying to hurt people, but because unexamined spiritual shadows in the hands of the admired is one of the most potent forms of distortion there is. So Aubrey's not evil. He's not a cult leader. He's just a man on a spiritual path who happens to have power, desire, and influence all colliding in real time. And that's a combustible mix, all right? But he can learn to step out of the spotlight and truly listen, not just to applause, but to the discomfort, to critique, to emotional nuance. He might actually become a leader he already believes himself to be. And to me, that's the important lesson here. It's not to criticize Aubrey. It's not to say he's horrible, but it's to say that he could truly work through this and become the model to the other men that he is trying to support. Okay? All right, let's talk about Vylana now. All right, and so I don't know these people. I have followed them. I have seen some of their journey, but I don't religiously follow them. But this is the impression that I get. So Vylana is a woman who loves deeply. You can really see that she's not faking it. She has a sacred bond with Aubrey that she's fought to protect, to evolve, and to surrender into again and again. But in my opinion, when a woman is constantly speaking of the higher path, talking about trusting the medicine, saying, I choose this because I choose love, yet her eyes lack fire, Her voice lacks certainty. Her body seems smaller than before. You start to wonder if this surrender is actually a resignation in disguise. Sometimes we confuse being evolved with being silent about our needs. So is she playing small for the relationship? So let's be completely transparent. Vylana is intelligent, intuitive, and incredibly tuned in. So when she says things like, I've had to work through so many parts of myself to welcome Alana in, or this is my path too, I trust it completely. It might be true and incomplete because here is the risk. She's now part of a relationship that's being publicly defined by someone else, Aubrey, and is spiritually validated by Dr. Gafni. She's no longer just a sovereign woman in a sacred marriage. She's a spiritual symbol in someone else's mythos. And when you become the divine feminine counterpart to a man pursuing multiple partners under the flag of eros and freedom, your own inner no starts getting lost in the noise of someone else's yes. So these were some possible red flags that I saw. Energetic shrinking, all right? Vylana used to fill the room. Now she feels like she's holding herself back to make space for something or someone else. I hear the language of acceptance, but without much excitement. So she doesn't sound like a woman who's lit up by this new arrangement. She sounds like a woman who's doing the work to accept it. And then the third thing is over-spiritualization of pain. This is all for our highest evolution, can sometimes be code for, I don't feel safe enough to say that I'm hurting, okay? So this is what might be happening inside her, but what is not being said. She might be afraid of losing Aubrey if she doesn't evolve with them. She might feel pressure to be the awakened partner, always transcending jealousy or insecurity. She might be confused, feeling spiritual pride for choosing love, but emotionally drained for suppressing her truth. None of this makes her weak. In fact, it just makes her human, and it makes this conversation even more important. So here are a few things that I think that she could do to reclaim her voice. So instead of radical monogamy, how about radical self-honesty? All right, not what she thinks she should feel, but what she actually feels with no spiritual coding. She could also get some more private support, a therapist, a guide, or a mirror outside of the Aubrey Gafni feedback loop, someone who could help her hear herself again. Number 3 could be rage, grief, desire, expressing everything she's maybe been told to alchemize into softness. Sometimes the path forward is through unfiltered truth. And then lastly, speaking without agreement. What would it sound like for her to say, actually, I don't like this. I'm struggling with this. That one sentence might liberate thousands of women who are spiritually tolerating relationships that just don't feel good, okay? Now let's talk about Alana. She's the third presence in this sacred triad, and I'll be real with you. Watching her in this podcast, I felt a mix of both admiration and concern, because on the surface, Alana presents as very graceful, receptive, emotionally intelligent. She uses words like sovereignty, authenticity, and alignment, and she speaks with care and presence, but under that polished exterior, there's something else I felt, and that's the energy of a woman trying to stay balanced while walking a tightrope that she didn't build. All right, so Alana is stepping into a relationship that's already formed. Aubrey and Vylana have a long history, a marriage, a public image, a spiritual brand, and she's the new addition. And while the framing is that of equal union, let's be honest, no one enters a triangle from the top. All right, so in the podcast, she talks about facing her own fears, doing deep inner work to feel worthy of this dynamic, and trusting the process and surrendering to love. But here's the real tension. When someone says they're working so hard just to belong, are they choosing from freedom or from a survival need to be accepted? For me, you could feel how hard she's trying to do it right, to be evolved enough, to be open enough, spiritually mature enough to handle being the other woman who's now being asked to step into something sacred. But here is where I get concerned. When women are taught that pain is the initiation and that jealousy is just a lack of inner work, they start to override their nervous system in the name of consciousness. And I saw that in Alana. Not that she's faking it. I think she believes she's in alignment, but believing you're safe and actually being safe are not the same thing. I could speak from personal experience. And especially in a power structure where the host of the podcast is your new partner and the philosopher on the couch is backing his every single word. All right, so let's not romanticize this. She's being spiritually onboarded into this marriage. She's joining a dynamic that already has mythology, vocabulary, and sacred rules. And she's adapting to a culture built by two people who've been together for years. And what that means is she risks losing herself to belong. She risks becoming a spiritual accessory, the embodiment of radical love, rather than a woman with full agency to say, this doesn't actually work for me. And she also risks silence because when everything gets spiritualized, expressing doubt starts to feel like you're the one who's unevolved. So is this consent or submission dressed in spiritual language? And there's a big difference between someone saying, I choose this because I feel wildly expanded and sovereign versus I choose this because I want to be the kind of woman who can handle it. One is empowered, the other is a performance of worthiness. So in this podcast, I heard phrases like, I had to look at the parts of me that didn't feel enough, or this dynamic is showing me my deepest patterns. To me, this translates to this relationship is triggering her wounds, which yes, can be medicine, but only if the container is actually safe. If it's not, it becomes re-traumatization in disguise. All right, so let's talk about the power dynamics, all right? Power dynamics matter, and let's not pretend this is a level playing field. Aubrey is the center of gravity. Vylana has already established emotional authority as the divine wife, and Dr. Gafni is spiritually endorsing the whole thing. And Alana, well, she's being welcomed in, but also watched. Every reaction, every feeling, every doubt becomes a test of her spiritual readiness. And that's a dangerous place to be because if she ever says, this doesn't feel good, she risks being seen as unevolved, reactive, or not ready. To me, that's not a partnership, that's emotional performance. So if Alana is going to thrive and not just survive in this dynamic, here's what I'd suggest. Number one, an independent guide. Someone outside of the triad, not Aubrey's friends, not Vylana's mentors, someone who's not spiritually invested in this relationship continuing. Number two is having her own voice publicly. A chance to speak freely, not just in agreement. A chance to name her discomfort, her longings, her no's, without feeling like she's destabilizing the love temple. Number three is having more time apart, just to recalibrate, to see what she wants outside of the story. Does she still want it when it's not surrounded by candles, cameras, and Gafni quotes? And then the last one is permission to leave without losing her identity, because if she decides this isn't it, she needs to know that doesn't make her less conscious, just more honest, okay? So Alana is courageous, that's not in question, but courage isn't the same as consent, and surrender isn't the same as sovereignty, especially when the room is already full of other people's expectations, stories, and spiritual frameworks. I hope she keeps her center. I hope she knows that love doesn't require contortion. And I hope she remembers being the awakened woman isn't about tolerating more. It's about choosing yourself at every turn. All right, now the good part. Let's talk about Dr. Mark Gafni. Now, if you've been in the spiritual or intellectual circles for a while, his name might ring a bell, and not always in a good way. The man is incredibly articulate. Yes, he has a PhD from Oxford. He's co-founded centers like the Center for Integral Wisdom with Ken Wilber. He's written books on Eros, enlightenment, and what he calls the new human. So academically and philosophically, he's definitely way more accomplished than me, but to me, credentials don't always equal clarity. And spiritual wisdom doesn't always come with clean hands, because what is also true is that Mark Gafni has a long history of serious allegations of sexual misconduct. And this isn't conspiracy. This is well-documented controversy that you could just Google yourself. All right, and it matters, especially when we're looking at how power, consent, and intimacy are being discussed in this very podcast. So what role is he playing in this dynamic? So in this podcast, Dr. Gafni isn't just chiming in as a friend. He's framing the entire relationship between Aubrey, Vylana, and Alana as a philosophical breakthrough. He calls it a sacred response to a meta-crisis, a spiritual evolution beyond the traditional constructs of love. So on paper, that sounds super deep, But in practice, it feels like he's just giving Aubrey intellectual permission to do whatever he wants, as long as it's cloaked in big words like eros and freedom. The way Dr. Gafni talks about eros as this ultimate force of evolutionary life energy sounds really profound, but in this context, it's being used to blur the line between spiritual calling and personal desire. And he never challenges Aubrey. He doesn't ask hard questions. He just nods and reframes, and that's not what a mirror does. That's what an enabler does, okay? So here is the uncomfortable truth I felt watching it. Dr. Gafni's not there to balance the conversation. He's there to keep his seat at Aubrey's inner circle. Why? Because Aubrey has a platform, a following, influence, and when you've been exiled from a lot of spiritual communities like Gafni has, being brought into someone like Aubrey's world is a redemption arc. But what's the cost of the redemption? Does it come at the price of honesty? Of discernment? If Gafni is truly a spiritual elder, then where's the challenge? Where's the inquiry into whether this sacred triad is actually serving everyone equally? Where's the voice that says, eros without accountability can be chaos disguised as truth? So let's zoom out. The way they're describing this isn't just polyamory. It's being pitched as the next iteration of sacred relationship, a radical monogamy that somehow includes multiple partners, complete freedom, and total devotion. That sounds edgy, maybe even revolutionary, but without emotional safety, clear dynamics, and mutual initiation into that system, this becomes a slippery slope. And I'm not saying that sacred non-monogamy can't exist. I'm saying that when the structure is built by one man, blessed by a philosopher with a checkered past, and maintained by women who seem to be spiritually submitting rather than emotionally thriving, we need to stop and ask what's really going on, okay? Look, I'm not here to take down Dr. Gafni. I'm here to bring nuance. I respect intellect. I respect spiritual exploration. That's what I do myself. But when your past includes allegations of violating trust and boundaries, and your present includes co-signing a dynamic that feels spiritually lopsided, you don't get a free pass because you use big words. We need to keep an eye on the energy underneath the language, because eros without grounded consent isn't evolution, it's a well-dressed escape. And if we're going to talk about sacred union, let's make sure we're not just watching an echo chamber of yes men and yes women, but a circle where raw, unfiltered, uncomfortable truth is welcome at the table. All right, fam, so I think that's it for today. Look, these conversations aren't easy. It's always easier to nod along, play it cool, and spiritualize over the discomfort, but growth doesn't come from avoiding the shadows. It comes from shining light on what's not being said. So if you're in a relationship that's being called sacred, but your gut is screaming otherwise, listen to it. If your spiritual circle is full of beautiful words but no space for your raw truth, question it. And if you're following someone who feels more like a brand than a human, don't be afraid to zoom out and see the full picture. All right. I got a lot of love for everyone in that podcast. Aubrey, Vylana, Alana, and to some extent, even Dr. Gafni, but love doesn't mean silence. Love asks for honesty. So here's my invitation to you. Share this episode with someone who's deep in the spiritual world but needs a reality check. Tag me if this resonated. And if you're walking your own path of radical truth and conscious love, keep going. Just make sure you're doing it in your voice, not someone else's. Thanks for being here. I'm Seibo Shen. Stay real, stay grounded, stay sacred. Peace.